So in this section, we're going to be talking about optionals. Now, if you have looked into the Swift language, played around with it, went to websites, read some books, went onto forums, etc., you undoubtedly have heard about optionals. Optionals are one of the first things that people run into when dealing with Swift that sort of throws up a bit of a hurdle. Although it is just a different way of dealing with a common problem, it is one that can be a bit confusing for people. But the purpose of this section is to take you through optionals with some very simple, straightforward examples, such that when you come out of it, you will clearly understand how to use optionals, and it will no longer be a mystery. But it is one of the sort of key staples of Swift, and it's almost a rite of passage, if you will, to understand optionals before you can consider yourself a Swift programmer. So before we get into code samples, let's take a look at some things about optionals and how it also relates to things with Objective-C as well. So with optionals, one of the important points to know is that they do not exist in Objective-C. However, results can be simulated, and we will look at some examples of what that means. But essentially, an optional is simply a way of dealing with nil or null. It's dealing with the absence of information, and Objective-C has the ability to do that, but it's handled very, very differently and less safely than how it is handled within the Swift language. Next, within Swift, a optional is an enum data type. Now, I know we have not talked about these. Enum, or enum as it's sometimes called as well, stands for enumerated. It's an enumerated data type, so it's a data type that can take many different values. And within Swift, if we're thinking of an optional, it is an enum data type that essentially has one value being some value, whatever value you wanted to put into it, and the other value being none, or what can be referred to as nil. So it's important to understand that an optional is an enum data type, and it is a data type of its own. Now, with an enum and with the optional data type, in this case, the data type, as we said, is either going to be nil or it's going to be the typed value. Now, when we talk about nil, nil is a pointer to a non-existent object in Objective-C. So, and there's going to be a difference here with Swift. And one of the key problems that you come across if you've worked in Objective-C is when you try to reference an object that is pointing to nil or that has not been instantiated, depending upon that object and the circumstance, it can crash your program. And it's a very common way for programs to crash in Objective-C. And it is really the reason why this concept of an optional was created in the Swift language, was to deal with this notion of a lot of crashing happening because of nil in a safer way, in a way that could be found out to some degree at compile time, and just a better way of handling it so that it leads to less errors in your own code. So it's important to know that even nil is different between Swift and Objective-C. So again, in Objective-C, nil is going to be a pointer to a non-existent object. However, in Swift, nil means none, but it is not a pointer. So again, as we mentioned with this enum data type, it can be either a value or it can be none. It's going to be one of these two, and none is a value within the enum data type for this optional. The next part that you need to be aware of, and it really flows from how these optionals are set up, is that all variables and all constants must be initialized in Swift. So we didn't talk about this during the variables section because it was important to address this concept of nil and what these optionals do before we can really sort of fully flesh this out. But if you have a variable defined with a var, if you have a constant defined with a let, again, this is on the Swift side of the equation, they must have a value. So you will not be able to run the program, if you will, if those variables or those constants don't have a value. Now, when you assign a variable or a constant to be of an optional type, that optional can be nil or none, as we said, in which case it's possible then to have no value being assigned to a variable and constant. But since none is a valid type within an optional context, that's a valid thing to have. And again, we'll look at this in code and it'll be very, very clear. But it is important to understand within the Swift language that all variables and all constants must be initialized. And additional, that goes for floats and ints as well. Remember, those are structs. We looked at that in the previous section on variables, that unlike Objective-C, where those are primitive data types, ints, floats, doubles, bools, etc. are all structs, and they must all be initialized as well. And optionals will be used not only for string data types or arrays we may look at, or dictionaries or classes, but they may be used for ints and floats, because all data types here must be initialized. So let's dive in and take a look at what this looks like in practice.